So I've been asked to do a little bit of professional development with Westcliff. I've been working with the board of directors a little bit, and it's been very interesting to see, you know, the program as it's developing. But originally, I was on the faculty of UCLA, the Department of Applied Linguistics, and worked there for over 30 years. And then I decided to take early retirement so I could travel around the world and do teacher development. So that's what I've been doing for about the last 10 years. And I work a lot for US Department of State doing teacher training in a whole variety of countries. My next country that I'm going to is Iraq. So that's going to be very interesting. I haven't ever been there. And then after that, I have another assignment in Thailand, in Bangkok, and following that, another assignment in Myanmar. So that's where I'm headed in the near future. Let's see, March in Seattle for TESOL, April in Iraq, May in Thailand, and June in Myanmar. So, and I do a lot of basic TESOL methodology stuff, but my main areas of expertise are content-based instruction and teaching pronunciation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about content-based instruction today. So I think maybe without further ado, so I don't take up, you know, all of your class time, I'll go ahead and start with the lecture. And it'll be probably about 40 minutes, I'm hoping. But please, because this is very informal, feel free at any point to just speak up and say, hey, I have a question, or could you elaborate a little bit more on that? So what I was asked to talk about, and I hope this fits in with the content of the course that you guys are doing, is curriculum design and revision. And I have a lot of interest in curriculum. I didn't mention that when I was at UCLA for the period of time that I worked there, I was the coordinator of their matriculated program for ESL students, EFL students. So we had about, oh gosh, several thousand international students that were, even though they were regular UCLA students, they were required to take ESL courses, and I was in charge of the curriculum for those students. So that sort of is a little explanation for my interest in curriculum. All right, so what I'm going to talk about. I want to start with a little bit of terminology, because I think that very often when we talk about curriculum and syllabus, they sort of mush together, but in fact they are rather distinct, and I want to make the distinction between that and the other components that make up a curriculum. I'm going to talk a little bit about standards. What are standards? Why do we need standards? And what are some of the popular standards that we have in our profession? A little bit about the syllabus, and I want to make the distinction which is typically made in the field between a synthetic syllabus and an analytic syllabus. If those are new terms, don't worry about it, because I'll give some examples. When we talk about a curriculum, obviously one of the cornerstones of a curriculum is materials. So I want to talk a little bit about the role of materials. And then in terms of the curriculum itself, I'll go through some of the following issues. So how does one decide on program content? What is the basic process for planning curriculum? What's the difference between a horizontal versus a vertical curriculum? How do we assess and revise curriculum? And then what kind of considerations do we need to pay attention to when we revise? So does that sound okay as an agenda? Yeah? Okay, good. At least I can see you guys nodding, and that's helpful. It's always difficult when you come from the outside and you don't know much about the course that's being taught, or you know what you already know. So if I am covering stuff that you already know, I apologize for that kind of in advance. Okay, so in terms of the sort of terminology, the main things I want to focus on are standards and benchmarks, the curriculum itself, the syllabus and its role within the curriculum, and materials and how materials play out inside of a curriculum. What is a standard? Okay, so standards are local or state or provincial or national goals as they're written for a target group of students with the aim of providing common standards across that population. Maybe you're familiar with some common standards already. Have you talked about standards in the course at all, or have you read about those? Okay, what have you been talking about?
Yeah, this is our second meeting, so.
Okay,
yeah,
so not a whole lot. Okay, well, that's fine. I'm happy to just sort of go through the content and talk about it, and then you can follow up on that. So see how we go there. The reason that we have standards, and it's probably pretty self-evident, is that when we have programs, across a system like the K-12 system in the United States or an intensive English program system in the United States, all of these programs, if we just leave them to their own devices, are going to have different ideas about what they should be teaching. And yet when students graduate, say, from grade 7, and they enter grade 8, if students move from one school district to another, it's very helpful to know what exactly does that student know at the end of grade 7. So standards are there just to set out some kind of clear expectations for all people who are involved in the educational enterprise, including the public. It's very important to communicate your standards of education to, for example, parents when we're talking about the K-12 system. Or if we're talking about adult education, students are paying for their own education, and it behooves us to let them know what they can expect from a particular program. So that's the goal of standards. And do you mind if I take this? I'm waiting for a work person. 1 minute. It may not be anybody relevant at all.
Okay.
Hello? Hello? I'm back, so sorry.
No worries.
Okay. And then finally, standards guide the local development of instructional goals and objectives. So very often, if the standards are written, when we're developing a curriculum, we can look at the standards and we can develop the curriculum in keeping with those particular standards. So we sort of look at the standards and then we figure out what is our curriculum going to look like and how does it mesh with those particular goals and objectives that are set out in the standards. When we talk about our profession, and I'll get to this in a minute, TESOL, the international organization, has a number of different standards that we can access. Some of them are free and available on their website, and for some of them you pay sort of a minimum amount of money. So there are standards for example, adult education programs, and these are very helpful for people in our profession who are developing curriculum. Okay, so I just mentioned the TESOL standards. These are some of the standards that are available on the TESOL website. There's the pre-12 to that should be pre-K to 12, sorry, pre-K to 12 English language proficiency standards. There are standards for the use of technology. There are the TESOL MCATE standards. There are standards for adult education. And then some countries have actually had projects to make the TESOL standards more relevant to their particular country. So here I've mentioned the China EFL project, which is also available on the TESOL website. I know that Egypt had a very large project as well, where they sort of made the TESOL standards a little bit more, fine-tuned them for their particular culture and their particular educational system. So some of these are also linked to the TESOL website in terms of the standards. And I think if you've never seen standards, it's really worthwhile to go on to the website and take a look at them, because it gives you an idea of what eventually you might be having to sort of deal with in terms of writing your own lesson objectives and tailoring those to particular standards. a really, really big one today is the CEFR, the Common European Framework of Reference. And obviously in Italy, that would be a really big thing. Yeah, yeah. And we haven't adopted these in the States, but I would say that the CEFR is pretty international. So if you go to Japan, for example, they will talk about, you know, their curriculum conforming to the CEFR and also determining students' levels according to what level of the CEFR are they part of. And then the third one that I'll just mention here was a massive project that was conducted in Canada. And these are the Canadian benchmarks. And again, I'll send the handout to you so you have the handout. But this is the URL for the Canadian benchmarks. And I believe they're free, but if they're not, because I think I've also seen that booth at TESOL, they're very, very cheap. So these are well-respected benchmarks where a lot of research went into creating them. So these are just sort of three ones that you'll hear mentioned: the TESOL standards, the CEFR, the Canadian benchmarks. There are many, many more that I'm probably not even familiar with. But these are, again, sort of an anchor for us to reality to say, okay, if most of the world is talking about the CEFR, we probably should be familiar with it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, any questions or okay to just move on?
I was wondering about the Common Core standards. Are those just
those are yeah, I probably should have put that as a fourth item here, the Common Core standards, because that's the one that's probably mentioned most in the US right now. It's both most popular and also most under attack because there are a lot of people who, you know, don't agree with the Common Core standards, and a lot of people who think that they are the best thing that's happened. And, you know, yeah, so probably add that one to this particular list here. Okay, thanks for that. Yeah, so the term curriculum refers to an overall rationale for and the design of an institutional educational program. So basically the design of a program and its rationale. And it includes, for example, the educational purposes of a program. So what is this particular program aiming to do? It includes the content of the courses, the procedures for teaching, and the learning experiences that students need to have in order to achieve these purposes. It also includes, obviously, how do we assess whether these purposes have been achieved or not? And that sounds huge, right? And it really is. I mean, a curriculum has to be responsible. Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm going to take this one too. 1 minute. Hello? Yes, this is Donna. You're calling what? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm on a call right now. Can't talk. Oh. Okay, so sorry. So the means of assessing whether or not these purposes have been achieved. Any questions there, or we're okay to move on?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Okay. The syllabus, on the other hand, right, is the public document that defines the content of a particular course. So when we talk about a program, we're really talking about the curriculum. And the curriculum is made up of various components. Each one of those components should have some kind of a public document that defines the course content, that lists course objectives, components, requirements, etc. Certainly all of the courses that, you know, are being offered at Westcliff have very, very detailed syllabuses, because I've seen those and I've actually had input into some of those in the very early stage when I was first brought on to the board of directors. So I would say that a syllabus is something that is very, very important in today's educational system because of student rights to know what it is that they are learning and what the objectives are and what the means are going to be to assess them. But to be honest, when I was a student back in, a couple of years ago, as an undergraduate, many, many years ago, I don't even remember even being given a course syllabus by my professors at the university where I studied. Maybe we had a list of textbooks that we were supposed to purchase, maybe a one-page handout that listed the professor's office and office hours. So I think syllabus is something today that most teachers are required to create. Very often there's sort of an institutional form or an institutional template for the syllabus that we write. And I think that we've come a long way in terms of sort of writing the syllabuses. But in doing a lot of program evaluation, which is one thing I do when I work in my capacity as educational consultant, I very often run up against institutions where the teachers say, well, the syllabus is really in my head. And that's, I think, a very dangerous thing. The syllabus should not be in the head of the instructor. It should be articulated on paper or on the website or in some form for the student. Very, very important for us to do that. Okay, materials. I don't think I really need a definition for that, but I'd like to expand the definition way, way beyond the idea of the textbook that we use. So it refers really to any text, to any images, to any digital technologies, or to the use of any kind of realia that we use in the process of conducting a lesson. And depending on what kind of population we have, we may not have a textbook. We may write our own materials, or we may be very, very bound to a particular textbook and not have a lot of flexibility. And all of those are possibilities within our profession. I myself have been pretty fortunate in most of my teaching that I've had a lot of leeway. I've been often able to select the textbook that I use rather than be given a textbook. But I think in many situations, particularly say intensive English programs or the K-12 context, the textbook is something that the teacher is given and is told to make the best use of as possible. So the course text can be, and usually is, very, very central. And then most publishers today will also make all sorts of ancillary materials available, websites, teachers' manuals, and teachers, of course, love these because it does help them in their job of teaching the class to have as many materials as possible. I just did a program in Nepal last summer with another specialist, and our job was to, the teachers were being asked to change from the course text series that they'd been using to a completely new course text series, and to give them the rationale for that and to sort of help them along with that. And they were thrilled because this new text had so many more materials than the previous text series had. So that sort of helped to mitigate their reluctance to get rid of the old lesson plans and have to write all new lesson plans to go along with the new course text, because it had videos and it had cute little readers that were additional that the teachers could use that were fiction but very nicely illustrated. Really a beautiful, beautiful product. And the teachers were, really actually excited to be changing to a new course text. And then, of course, teachers do their own thing, and they bring in their own supplementary materials that they choose to use, or that they think would be interesting for their learners to explore. So just to recap how these things are different. So we have standards, we have the curriculum, we have the syllabus, and we have the materials. Standards are global. They state the goals and objectives that guide the institution, not a particular class, but rather the institution itself as to teacher education and curriculum planning. The curriculum is a sort of dynamic interplay of the planning and enacting and evaluating. The syllabus is the plan for a particular course, and the materials are the tangible resources, any resources that teachers might use in their day-to-day teaching. So all of the above constitute designs for learning, but they're at different levels and in an ideal world, and this is maybe the most important important statement that I'm going to be making. They should all be aligned. In other words, the curriculum should, in terms of its philosophy, match the philosophy of the standards. The syllabus should match the philosophy of the curriculum, and the materials should be chosen in keeping with the syllabus and the curriculum and the standards. And this is the really, I think, tricky part of putting together a curriculum. And who designed that curriculum? Who was involved? Was it a sort of a top-down decision where the teachers are then told, here's the curriculum you have to teach from? Or was it more of a bottom-up process where the teachers had input into the curriculum? My bias is probably showing here because I do think that teachers should be involved in, putting the curriculum together. They know the students better than very often the program administrators. And I'm talking from the perspective of a program administrator. So, I'm not dissing program administrators here, but I think that all of this is very organic, and it's by no means a really easy thing to do to put together a curriculum. It's a very difficult balancing act.
I had one quick question. I just was curious if syllabi are being written now at all levels, all grade levels. I always think of syllabi being given maybe at a university level, maybe high school, but are they being written now for all grade levels?
I don't really know that because I am not very much in the K-12 context. I'm thinking that they're probably more institutionalized in the K-12 context, whereas, at the university, professors usually tailor their own syllabus, although they might be given. I know one of the institutions that I worked for, we had a sort of standard syllabus, and then if instructors wanted to tailor the syllabus for the course, they could add additional stuff to it, but it sort of helped them in the process of writing it. So that's a good question, and I don't really know the answer to it, but I suspect that you're right, that it's more something that we see maybe in high school, at high school level, and then obviously in any kind of adult education. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, so standards. I'm going to go kind of backwards. So we can kind of think of this as a pyramid if you want. We start with the standards and then we build upon those standards. We build our curriculum, in sort of pyramid fashion on top of the standards. The syllabus would be built on top of the curriculum, and then the materials would be selected and maybe also produced by teachers, but again, that idea that all of these should be well articulated and that they should be interconnected, that we don't just go off on our own and create materials without reference to the syllabus, without reference to the curriculum, and without reference to the standards. And that's a very idealized picture. Because many places that I go, and I've also done numerous program evaluations, not so much in the US, but especially in a lot of other countries where English language teaching is more developing, places like West Africa, you may see not very much evidence of standards at all, not very much evidence of a curriculum, not very much evidence of a syllabus, but just teachers working with materials. And that's the reality of it, I think. I did a program in West Africa with teachers in the Islamic schools. And literally in that area of the world, if you speak a tiny bit of English, you become the English teacher. And these teachers didn't even have access to materials to use. So they were just, using the blackboard and chalk. And I don't think they had any idea what standards or curriculum or syllabus were all about. And they were very thirsty and hungry for materials and very thirsty and hungry for any kind of ideas for what they could do in their classroom. So, I think I just wanted to make sure that we understand that this is a very idealized picture. A well-tuned institution probably has all of these things, but not all of them do. Okay, so the syllabus, very, very familiar thing for all of us, I think, because we work with syllabuses. I think that the syllabus is if we had to choose a metaphor, I would choose the metaphor of roadmap. So a syllabus is a roadmap that we as teachers consult to plan our route in advance. And it's also the roadmap that we give students at the beginning of a course to say, this is where our course is going to take you. We're going to follow this route and we're going to end up at this destination. But along the route and along the way, things happen. Students, you may find that the syllabus isn't completely attuned to the needs of the students, or that a unit that has been chosen is of no interest at all to the students. And so teachers often, on their own, will make adjustments in the syllabus as they teach the course. So when I, as a teacher, for example, decide how am I going to travel from point A to point B, I need to consider, who is traveling with me. The person that's traveling with me, metaphorically, is my students, right? And if they need a rest break, then I probably have to pull over and find a restroom for them. Or if they are, not happy with the meal that's been prepared for them, I have to find some other kind of meal to prepare for them. Lots of metaphors coming in here. So as we travel, we meaning the teacher and the students, we have to sort of periodically consult our map and determine, are we traveling in the right direction? Here we are, here's our sort of not very straight route from point A to point B, but then along the way, I might decide, I'm gonna take a shortcut because my students already know this material, and I don't want to waste a lot of time. I don't want to bore a lot of students. I'm going to move on to the next thing that is new in the syllabus. Or they might say, I'm really interested in something that's not on the syllabus. And good teachers usually will find a way to respond to that by bringing in something that interests the students. So that's maybe, we could think of that as a detour on our road. Our time might be limited. That might cause us to take a detour. We might want to get someplace in a more efficient manner because our students seem to know this already. Or there might be something interesting that we hadn't previously considered covering, but that seems to be appropriate for the particular group of students that we have. And we have enough time to take that little detour and maybe enrich the student's experience. So this is from an article that I did a little while back, this whole idea of the detour and the shortcut. So here's our shortcut and here's our detour, right? Yeah. Does that make sense and logical? All right.
Very clear. Very good.
Yeah. I love metaphors and I love visuals. Okay, so from a really conceptual standpoint, now I want to move into the two different types of syllabuses. And this is from pretty old work in the field by Wilkins, I think way back in '78. He said a language syllabus falls into two broad categories, synthetic and analytic. So the first one, which is much more a traditional way of creating a syllabus, is what's called the synthetic approach. And so I'm going to give you some examples of an example of each one. And then the second type of syllabus approach, which, for example, is the kind that we would use in putting together a course that uses communicative language teaching as its methodology, is the so-called analytic approach. Okay, so what's the difference between a synthetic approach and an analytic approach? In a synthetic approach, language is broken down into little pieces. This may or may not sound familiar, depending on when you learned language. In my case, this is very, very familiar because when I first learned language way back in 7th grade, it was using grammar translation methodology, and in that case, we were fed little bits and pieces of the language, and the idea was to kind of put them together in some kind of a puzzle. So it might be bits of grammar, it might be bits of vocabulary, it might be bits of the sound system of the language, it might be functional bits that are broken into various steps. And the idea is that the learners acquire this gradually, and they eventually build toward mastery. Their main task, the task of the learners, is to put these bits and pieces together to eventually be able to speak the language in some kind of manner that we would deem proficient. In a minute, I'll give you an example of this so you can kind of get a better idea. And the analytic approach is going to be the exact opposite. So language is presented more holistically. It's not broken down into sort of discrete bits and pieces. You start rather with things like a topic or a text or a task. And these are things that should be identified as relevant to the learner's needs and interests. If you look at most textbooks today, most ESL or EFL textbooks, and you look at chapter 1 or chapter 3, very, very frequently these begin with some kind of a theme, like if it's for very beginning learners, my family, or if it's for more advanced learners, it might be global warming. Of course, we know that doesn't exist anymore. But sorry. Yeah. So anyway, topics, tasks, these kinds of things. Whereas in the textbooks that I learned from, chapter 1 might have said the simple present tense, and chapter 2 might have said the present continuous tense. Those are the bits and pieces that we were fed. And these are very almost diametrically opposed ways of putting a syllabus together. Okay, so the learner's task in an analytic approach makes sense is to sort of take these pieces apart and analyze them. And the teacher's job is to help them see the logic behind the language. And then in the process, the learner gains mastery of the system. Okay, so synthetic and analytic. This is the sort of more communicative approach. So I'm going to give 2 examples. I'm going to give an example of the synthetic syllabus, and I'll give an example of the analytic syllabus. And I'm going to pick, these are pretty much from my own experience as a language learner and a language teacher. Sad to say, I learned French via grammar translation starting in 7th grade. To this day, I still do not speak French. And then I'm going to talk about content-based instruction, which is one of my areas of interest and expertise. Okay, so grammar translation typically consisted of a lot of memorization. I remember in my French textbook, half of the book was things like grammatical paradigms in the back of the book, the irregular verbs and vocabulary and lists of vocabulary with translations next to them. A lot of focus on grammar rules, a lot of focus on memorization of vocabulary, a lot of focus on the verbs and the various paradigms for the verbs. And this was really what we sometimes also refer to as rules-based learning. So like I mentioned, in the textbook table of contents, you'd see gerunds and infinitives, the present tense, relative clauses, rather than, my family or, volunteer vacations. The learners did a lot of translation from the second language into their first language, and the teacher typically conducted the class in the student's first language, focused on presentation of rules and sort of the grammatical parsing of texts. I remember, having to do sort of sentence diagrams. I remember, having to learn the rules and explain the rules in English for French grammar. And I remember that the teacher would come in, often write 10 sentences on the blackboard, and our job was then to translate those 10 sentences, and then we were told whether that was correct or not correct. No pair work, no group work, nothing like that. Very little contextualization of the language that was being taught. So that's an example of the synthetic syllabus. This is a typical grammar translation task. I actually found this on the internet, but I really like it a lot because it looks so much like the syllabuses or the materials that I used when I was learning French. This one happened to be for German, but how do you like my new apartment? I find it beautiful. How do you like my new desk? I find it modern. How do you like my new car? I find it excellent. How do you like my 2 new chairs? I find them comfortable. I love you. Do you love me? This is that lack of contextualization. And Mr. Fisher, this book is for you. Probably none of these being things that I will ever say in that language that I'm learning. And then vocabulary and structures were very, very controlled in grammar translation, for example. So I remember, because I was trained as a teacher, also I was a teacher of German initially, that you presented something like 5 new vocabulary items, and you didn't want to do more than that because the students wouldn't understand you at all. You corrected errors in translation on the spot. The tests focused really on mastery of the rules, and there was little use of the L2 by the learners. So that's kind of a little bit more about grammar translation. The opposite example now of the analytic syllabus is, I'm going to give the example of content-based instruction, but other examples would be task-based instruction, or some of the other ones that fit under that kind of communicative language paradigm, where we begin with a theme, some kind of a theme like that has been chosen to supposedly be of high interest to the learners: online romance, save the environment, stress busters, and also has to be appropriate for the culture in which we're teaching. So online romance might be something that we wouldn't do, you know, in Lebanon, for example, or other countries. Okay, so the selection of topics and texts, that's where we begin. We begin with the motivating topic and the motivating text. And then next, we look at the goal of instruction. How are learners going to be able to comprehend the texts that we've chosen to go along with the topics? And how are they going to be able to discuss issues or express opinions related to the unit's content and that are central to this content-based instruction? How do we select language? Language is actually selected for its importance and its relevance to the unit's content. So the unit, the selection of topic really drives the selection of language, whereas in, say, the previous approach, the grammar translation or the synthetic approach, we started with the language, and we probably didn't even bother with some kind of a contextualizing device. Texts are generally in content-based instruction, and in most communicative language, most forms of communicative language teaching, they aim for authenticity. At upper levels, they are authentic. Maybe at more beginning levels, they're simulated authentic, but they're chosen to be kind of a rich environment for learning. Yeah. And language is then illustrated through examples from the texts that have been chosen to accompany the topic that we're working with. If it's online romance, we've chosen some texts, both a listening text and a reading text, and probably some graphics as well, and maybe a YouTube video that would contextualize the language that we're trying to teach. The idea is that we balance accuracy and fluency in this kind of a method. So fluency probably takes precedence over accuracy, whereas in grammar translation, accuracy was the main thing, and there was very, very little focus on fluency. But within something like content-based instruction, or in general communicative language teaching, the idea is to have sort of a balanced focus on both. And then teachers would designate some portion of their learning to building communicative skills, and maybe other portions of their learning to drawing attention to accuracy. So there might be a portion of the lesson where you devote to working with accuracy, but other portions of the lesson where you're really working just on fluency. I'll stop there for a minute for either comments or questions. Any comments or questions?
Do you have any questions or comments, Yere?
No, I think I'm following up very good.
You're following okay? Okay, I'll just move ahead. All
I
right.
just wondered if you've heard of Jane Willis.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Okay, because she's done a lot of work on task-based learning.
Yes, yes, uh-huh.
Okay, so.
Yeah. They're pretty big name in the field, yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
Mhm. Okay, so assessment, obviously, when we're doing content-based instruction, assessment's going to look very, very different than it would in grammar translation. And it generally focuses on the learner's ability to demonstrate comprehension of content through language. So it's kind of hard to pull content and language apart. They're really part of the same puzzle. There's more focus on the language, but again, because the content is kind of driving the selection of language, the students end up talking about the content and they demonstrate their mastery of language by showing their understanding of the content and maybe expressing opinions about the content at upper levels. So the goal is for the teacher to conduct the class in the second language and to create an environment where students are using the language for communicative purposes, really have sort of a maximum opportunity to use that language. So this would be one example of the analytic syllabus, putting the pieces together and using all of those pieces, analyzing all of those pieces and using them for communicative purposes. Okay. Common syllabus options, and you can kind of see how these look. So a grammatical syllabus would be pretty much what it says. The pieces are the various kinds of grammar in the English text. A notional syllabus would be here things like the syllabus would be structured around units that say talking about your weekend, going to the doctor, discussing a holiday plan. A functional syllabus. Both notional and functional syllabuses were really popular in the sort of early and mid 1970s, but not used a whole lot anymore, except maybe if you're trying to learn a language for travel purposes. If I'm going to go to Rome and I'm going to have to order food in a restaurant, then I might get a little tourist book that's kind of structured around a notional syllabus in case I get sick. How do I go to the pharmacy and order, or ask for some kind of drug that would help me? Functional syllabus, expressing likes and dislikes, asking for clarification, making invitations. Content-based syllabus, like I already mentioned, alien invasion, becoming a change agent, elder abuse, heroes. You start with a sort of general topic or theme, and you work from that theme. In a task-based syllabus, it would be things like deciding what to pack for a trip, planning for a wedding, determining how to prevent identity theft. So the syllabus itself has to include a whole range of things. It has to include goals for the course, topics, academic skills that you're going to be using, the content to be mastered, the grammar or vocabulary that's going to be studied. Ideally, a syllabus tells you what the timetable for the course is, what materials are you using, what are the textbooks that you have to purchase, or what's the course website that you're going to be using, what are the various assignments that you're going to be held accountable for as a learner, what kind of activities are we going to typically do in class, and what's the assessment or grading scheme. And this is, I think, a really nice list from Kathleen Graves, and pretty comprehensive. I mean, we're very familiar with what a syllabus looks like. Materials, on the other hand, could be just about anything, depending on what kind of learners we have. And if we're working with adult, maybe pre-literate learners or learners who are just acquiring literacy, they might look something like this, or this might be also appropriate types of materials for younger children. All sorts of things, course textbooks, supplementary readings, posters, pamphlets, poems, lyrics, the blackboard, internet links, short stories, lyrics, poems, slide presentations or PowerPoints, magazine pictures, photos, realia, podcasts, line drawings, puppets, games, YouTube videos, wordless cartoons. And I would say in my life as a teacher, I have used all of these. I used to run a small media center, so I'm very media driven in my own teaching. I actually had a magazine picture file way back in the 70s that teachers would come and borrow because that made the teaching more authentic. I love things like wordless cartoons. I like line drawings. I like a lot to work with poetry or song lyrics. But teachers are very, very creative by nature. And I'm the kind of teacher who I'm sitting in a plane looking at the in-flight magazine, and I see a page that's just perfect for, adapting to use in the classroom, and I tear that page out. So if you find a torn page in the airline magazine, that probably was me. I have whole sets of resources that I keep, especially for pronunciation teaching. I use a lot of cartoons, for example. This is actually my favorite book of stick figures, because I am not a stick figure artist. So I have to actually look at this book and figure out how to draw different stick figures. But it's a great, great book. So I'm giving you the source here. This is an example of wordless cartoons, another one of my favorites from Joan Ashkenaz, wordless cartoons, that she had the Mad Magazine cartoon artist actually draw for her. So materials should do the following things. They have, as I mentioned right at the beginning, they have to support the curriculum. You don't just choose any old materials and bring them in just because they're entertaining. And that's maybe my single number one pet peeve when I do observations, is that teachers very often, because they're nervous, think, oh, I have to have something really fun to show the observer, so I'm going to have a YouTube video that has no relation to my course whatsoever. So no, they have to support the curriculum. They should facilitate your job as a teacher. They should serve as the core of the course. They should maintain the quality of instruction. They should help to standardize and address your standards. They should be appealing. They should provide a variety of learning resources. Learners get very bored very quickly, and so sometimes just changing the material that you're using can be very helpful. They can also serve to educate teachers in new methodologies. They can get teachers to change their ways of teaching. They can help learners think critically, and they can inspire social action. I've just been asked I mentioned I'm going to Myanmar in June. The project there is a social action project, and they want to create a whole new curriculum where the theme is tolerance. And so that's sort of an example of a social action curriculum. And we'll probably have to, rather than use standard curriculum, or rather than use commercial textbooks, we'll probably be creating a lot of the materials that are relevant to that particular culture and that particular society. But because I haven't gotten into that, I don't really know what I'm getting into exactly, but it sounds really interesting to me. Okay, curriculum. So this is just something I found on the internet. I don't even, know the source of it, but I like this idea of showing how curriculum is kind of interconnected to the society, and how the government and educational policy and language policy, all of these things sort of are interconnected. Very often there is something like a national language policy, and that national language policy is going to dictate the kind of curriculum that we teach from, and it's the government that is deciding on that educational policy, and that educational policy then in turn has to reflect the values of the society. So this is sort of the broad picture of curriculum. It's not just that we set out to design a particular curriculum, but that we also have to be aware of issues within our society. The variables, primarily the teacher, the content, and the student, So that's what we're sort of looking at when we talk about the variables of the curriculum design. This again is from this wonderful article by Kathleen Graves that I highly recommend if you want one truly good source about curriculum. And she says, what is the actual curriculum planning process? You start by articulating guiding principles. You then analyze the contextual factors. You assess your learners' needs. You determine the program goals. You decide on the content. You organize the content, and then you design an assessment plan. So it's pretty step by step, and it's very, very logically laid out here. I think this is very useful. And then for each one of these, she has some kind of guiding questions. So for example, articulating guiding principles, what beliefs about learners and learning, teaching, and subject matter undergird the curriculum? Or for analyzing contextual factors, what social, economic, political, educational, and institutional factors impact the curriculum, etc. I think that if you are ever asked to design a curriculum, this is a really great sort of map to follow. Again, in the article, she talks quite a bit more in depth about some of these things. Feel free to chime in if you have questions or comments. Okay, so deciding on program content, what should be taught, how are we going to divide it into courses and into modules within each course, right? What should be emphasized in each course? How do these courses complement each other or build on each other? And how are we going to level them or sequence them? Sometimes we have a variety of courses at the same level. If we're splitting it up by skill level, we might have reading and writing level 1, listening and speaking level 1. That's really common in intensive English program curricula, for example. Not always, because we may have a multi-skills course. That was much more the case with the program that I designed at UCLA for the matriculated students, but we might have multiple courses at the same level, or we might have, for example, courses that are not required, that are elective, that students can take when they're at a particular level. And that's all part of the consideration. I said I would talk about horizontal versus vertical curriculum. I kind of like this idea because it was sort of a new one to me when I put this particular lecture together. But a horizontal curriculum is what we study at any given level, right? So what are the level-specific objectives in a curriculum? Whereas the vertical curriculum is where we look at the entire curriculum up and down from level to level. So what's studied across levels and what are the curriculum-specific objectives? So I think when we're assessing a curriculum, or once we've built a curriculum, before we actually, roll it out and use it with our learners, it's a good idea for us to kind of analyze it and critique it from both of these perspectives, from the horizontal perspective and from the kind of vertical perspective. This is, again, just a graphic that I found from the internet, but I like this idea of doing the evaluation in this particular way. So we start with maybe needs analysis, we move to objectives, we look at the testing and the materials and the teaching, and then we evaluate all of these, and then we go back through the same process again. So it's very cyclical. It's not a one-way street, it's more of a two-way street. So the needs analysis informs the objectives, but the objectives also help to inform the needs analysis. Testing obviously is built on the objectives, and the materials then are going to be relevant in terms of the teaching. So just kind of to look at the way that these things all feed into the bigger picture. This is just another graphic, kind of similar idea that it's a back and forth process when we're creating a curriculum. The needs analysis, the evaluation, the selection of materials, the planning of learning outcomes, the situation analysis, all of these things interact. So if it sounds really complicated, I think it truly is fairly complicated. There's no way of making curriculum planning a really easy process, which is why, again, I think having input from as many different parties is really an important piece of the puzzle, not just, the program director deciding on a curriculum, but bringing teachers into the process and getting their ideas. At UCLA, when I was the program coordinator, we had the teachers give feedback every term on the curriculum, as well as getting input from the students. And then we would meet at the end of the term and we'd go through all of their suggestions and we'd make minor adjustments in our curriculum for the next term, so that our curriculum was kind of always responsive to the teachers who were basically trialing it on the students and, making their own judgments about how effective it was or not effective. And that feedback from the teachers was just really invaluable in terms of keeping our curriculum really tight and making it most effective for our students. Okay, some questions to consider when you're revising the curriculum. Number one is, what do we want our learners to be able to do by the end of this course? And then in terms of the curriculum itself, by the end of this particular program that they're making their way through. And if they're not able to do what we want them to do, that is a signal of a problem. That means we're going to have to go back and revise either our expectations or some aspects of our curriculum, and probably both. What evidence is there that learners are learning what we want them to learn? It is our assessment actually tied to the curriculum. The problem might actually be not the curriculum, but the assessment measures that we're using that aren't carefully or closely tied to the curriculum. What kind of tasks do we set out for our learners to provide evidence in the assessment, for example? How are we going to evaluate all of this evidence? What kinds of questions are going to be part of our assessment of the learners? And then what do we do with these results? Very often programs collect results and they don't go the next step of saying, let's look at these results and let's see how we can make adjustments in our curriculum based on these results. And that's, I think, a really critical part of the entire process. So I think, we've done pretty well timing-wise. Any last minute questions or comments I'm happy to entertain, or if I didn't make myself clear in any way. I think this is a really important topic. I'm glad that this was chosen. It's something I'm pretty passionate about, and have spent a large part of my life learning how to do. So like I said, it sounds like a fairly complex procedure. It is a fairly complex procedure. There are things that help us as teachers a lot. Standards can help us a lot. Well-written textbooks, which are already tied to particular standards. So for example, most of the textbooks in the European Union today are tied to the SEPHR standards, and that means that your job as a teacher has been made much, much easier. But again, not knowing where we're going to end up, and I've ended up in so many different programs where sometimes there were excellent curricula already in place and sometimes there weren't. I think as teachers, we need to be pretty aware of this sort of complex process of curriculum design and revision.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we're always working on, it's like a work in progress. It's never finished, is it?
It is never finished. It is never finished. That's exactly it. Yeah. Couldn't have said it better. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's good. Reed, do you have any questions?
Yeah, just a little question. I was just thinking, I don't know much about curriculum, but I was thinking in a situation where, like you mentioned, in the West African countries where the teachers don't know much about, when you were saying that, I was just kind of thinking about West Africa. I'm from West Africa. So
Yeah.
I kind of get what you were saying there.
Where are you from exactly?
I'm from Nigeria.
Oh, okay, great.
Yeah, so
I've never been to Nigeria. I've only been to Senegal, and then I was in Mali. That's where I was doing the work with the teachers I mentioned.
Okay, it falls in place with Nigeria too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, what you were trying to mention too. So I was just thinking, a situation where the curriculum doesn't explain much, how can the teachers be able to formulate ways to write their syllabus or to teach in the classroom?
Well, I think that's probably a case where teachers are going to be more dependent on the textbook than anything else, assuming they have a textbook, right? And that might be a big assumption. That's where really careful textbook selection would be very, very important, where a textbook that's been written to conform to particular standards would be a really good thing. The other thing is that in places like that, I think teacher organizations can be really, really important ones, so that the teachers get some guidance from, say, their local TESOL chapter or some kind of local organization. Teachers depend a lot on training in those kinds of contexts. I know British Council does a lot of training of teachers, and then sort of getting some kind of leadership from within the teachers themselves, you know, creating teachers organizations. Those are the kinds of things that I've seen that work best in those kinds of contexts. The teachers that I worked with in West Africa, both in Senegal and in Mali, what we were doing was an intensive 3-week teacher training course with teachers who'd been selected from various government schools to give them the kinds of resources that they needed, teach them how to do some of their own materials development, teach them about some of the issues. But it's a huge job in a situation like that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, really, really, you know, that's something very near and dear to my heart, because I work so much in contexts like that. I'm generally sent not to places where there's already a nice, neat curriculum in place, but rather to places where there is no curriculum. So, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So you're going to be a great leader if you do go back to, you know, and do some work. You'll be so well prepared, and you'll be the teacher that others are looking up to and looking to for guidance.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
I've learned a lot today.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you guys so much for inviting me, and I really enjoyed, you know, the session, and wish you luck with the rest of your course, which sounds like you've got quite a bit of the course ahead of you still.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure having you with us.
Yeah.
We really appreciate your time.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. See you guys. Bye.
Thank you so much. Good luck.
Bye-bye.